Welcome back. I'd like to remind everyone that live captioning is available for this and all sessions. Just click the link at the bottom of your screen. And that this session will be recorded for future viewing, and we will be sending out additional information about that after the symposium ends. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit any and all questions. We will remind you that we will not have time to answer all of your questions, but we'll do our very best to get to as many as we possibly can. Also, in the interest of time, we've decided to forego all the full introductions. You can find more information about each of the panelists and the moderator in your program, or you can visit the website. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our graduate student from Museum Studies, Tiffany Miller, for assisting in this session. This session is incredibly important to me, and I know many of us in the audience, museums with parent organizations, vulnerabilities and strategies. I'm pleased to welcome our moderator, Kristina Durocher. Kristina is the director of the Museum of Art of the University of New Hampshire and president of the Association of Academic Museums and Galleries, which supports the protection of collections held in the public trust. Kristina, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Tiffany. So I'm really pleased to be here today and joined by our four panelists. Joining me for this conversation is Peter Dean, who participated as a trustee in the decision that Randolph-Macon Women's College should become co-educational in 2007 and change its name to Randolph College, and in the college's decision to raise money for its endowment from the sale of selected paintings from its art collection. We'll also be joined by Andria Derstine, who is the John G. W. Cowles Director of the Allens Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College. There, she has overseen de-accessioning, always undertaken conservatively and driven by considerations of quality and fit within the institutional mission. Also, we'll be joined by William Underwood Eiland, who is the director of the Georgia Museum of Art, University of Georgia, and former chair of the Professional Practices Committee for AAMD. And finally, we have Jamaal Sheats, who has an MFA and is the director and curator of Fisk University Galleries and an assistant professor in the Department of Art. Thanks for all joining me today. So to begin, I thought it would be helpful, and we as a group came together and thought that a little background information might forward this conversation. Each of us has different experiences with de-accessioning, and each of our panelists is going to provide a couple of minutes of background information about their role in de-accessioning processes. So Andria, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kristina. I'd really like to thank Kristina and my co-panelists and the organizers of the symposium. It's an honor to be with you here today. I also want to thank the many colleagues in the larger academic art museum community who have thought deeply about the issues we are discussing and have contributed to this conversation over many years. As others have said during these 2 days, de-accessioning is a normal museum practice for proper collections management. It is the issues around the use or proposed use of proceeds that have given rise to our conversations today and over the past several years. We're fortunate to have many guides in this matter. For AAMD museums, the AAMD guidelines, both those before last April and the currently amended guidelines, and AAMs, including importantly for many but not all institutions, the process of accreditation. We also have individual museums' own policies, procedures, and past practices, which may be longstanding, as well as those of our parent institutions, which for the most part, in terms of academic museums, are nonprofit, educational, and charitable institutions. So I want to acknowledge as well that almost every art museum in the US today is concerned about finances, especially in light of the pandemic, but also more generally, and also deeply concerned about the alarming surge in racial violence and general division in our country, and about sustainability. And that in such moments of extreme stress, it's normal to take a step back and take another look at current practice and consider whether revisions are necessary. I am at a collecting institution, and of course I can only speak from my personal viewpoint, realizing that what is right for one institution may well not be right for another of different governance structure, size, budget, location, or mission. I'm not here to judge other museums, directors, or trustees, as I have not walked in their shoes. I think that's why we all need to be very clear about our institution's mission, history, and values. My personal view is that for a collecting institution, a museum's collection is its lifeblood. It's what enables all that we do. The art we stored at the Eiland reflects the world, its history, ideas, identities, challenges, injustices, and joys. Our collections facilitate learning and community engagement, both for the college community, but also much more broadly for our local and regional community and national and international audiences. For me, there's no zero-sum choice between collection-centered and community-centered. They're all intertwined. So I don't advocate the use of the proceeds from de-accessioning for anything other than acquiring artworks for several reasons. One is frankly the slippery slope argument. AAMD for years held a bright line on this, and that has been incredibly important and helpful to nested institutions. My perspective has always been not to, shall we say, bite off more than you can chew. Raise funds for your initiatives in the traditional ways: relationships, donor cultivation, grants, the quality and authenticity of your programs, your scholarship, and your community outreach. I don't feel it's appropriate to go for a short-term gain that will almost certainly bring a long-term loss by selling from the collection to fund activities other than collection development. And I say a long-term loss because of two other reasons. For two other reasons. I believe it would be betraying the intent of both past and present donors and deeply discouraging to future donors to sell for other reasons, as well as potentially very detrimental to museums and their governing institutions' nonprofit status. Donors gave their works or funds restricted to the purchase of works, believing they were doing so for educational purposes, and the museum accepted them as cultural heritage held for posterity, not as fungible, capitalized assets. Selling works would irreparably harm efforts to solicit future support from individual donors and foundations by sending the message that private support is unnecessary, since additional items from an art museum's collection, not to mention other campus collections, could always be sold to cover budget shortfalls. Loyal benefactors give to academic museums to further the museum's and institutions' educational mission, and it is for us to properly store these works and our overall collections for posterity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Peter, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience at Randolph as a trustee?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Kristina. Happy to be here and enjoying the entire experience. I'm speaking as a former trustee of Randolph College and an institution which started 130 years ago as Randolph-Macon Women's College, a very small women's college in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is a fairly small city. I joined the board in 2006, and what I'm about to say isn't directly connected to art, but it gets intertwined with it. By the early aughts, Randolph-Macon Women's College, like so many women's colleges, was struggling with enrollment and tuition revenue. And the board was faced with decisions about what to do in order to fill the gap in revenues. The board made a series of hard decisions after a great deal of deliberation, which included a change to co-education so that the school admits men. That necessarily meant a change of name. It had been called Randolph-Macon Women's College. It is now Randolph College. And it also led to the recognition that we needed more money in the college's endowment. And that led directly, after a considerable amount of investigation and debate, to the sale of some works of art from the college's art collection. I need to tell you a word or two about the art collection. Randolph-Macon Women's College, now Randolph College, has a very distinguished collection of American art, which it started as far back as about 1914, with the collection of contemporary art. There was a visionary leader at the college at that time, Louise Jordan Smith, who was an art professor and insisted on the founding of an art collection. The genesis of this was an annual exhibition of contemporary art intended to bring the very best work to the college for the education of students, with the expectation that the college would directly purchase a work of art, preferably every year. The college has been doing that. The annual exhibition of contemporary art continues. The 109th annual exhibition is going on right now. It is, we believe, the longest running exhibition of contemporary art at any academic institution in the United States. And we continue to purchase, and there's usually direct purchases by the college of art from that exhibition. And if you follow that policy for a long time, and if you have consistent standards, you end up with some very fine work. The college has now got a significant collection of work. There's about 3,000 works in the collection. It has purchased other work, and work has been donated. When the current exhibition, it's virtual because the college is back in session now that there is a virtual exhibition available. When the college was faced with the hard and frankly very controversial decisions about turning to co-education and changing the name, which was not a small matter, we unfortunately antagonized some of the alumni. We knew we were going to do that, but we had no choice but to make these decisions in order to put the college on a sounder footing. When we were faced with those decisions, we also concluded that we had to raise more money for the endowment. One would normally think you do that through a capital campaign. Unfortunately, it's a long time to do a capital campaign when you have, unfortunately, antagonized some portion of your alumni because of other necessary changes. We felt that that simply was not a sustainable objective. We wanted to raise about $50 million. And in the end, and after a great deal of debate and frankly a painful decision, we concluded that we had to look to college assets, which included the college's art collection. That collection belongs directly to the college. It is, most of it today is housed in a building known as the Mayer Museum of Art at Randolph College. That is not, despite its name, an accredited museum. We don't have a statement of permanency. It is in fact the college's art collection, which for many, many years was just hung in buildings and classrooms and halls all around the college. Eventually, the college decided that the works were sufficiently valuable, we had to put them in better protection. Fortunately, the college had a building, which was somewhat surprisingly, I suspect to many of you, actually constructed in 1950 for the National Gallery of Art in Washington as an emergency repository in the case of a Cold War emergency. And it was purchased, it was built with funds from the National Endowment of the Arts. So it was a purpose-built building for a different purpose. By the 1970s, early 1980s, that was starting to be used as a storage gallery and display gallery for the college. And in 1983, with a very generous gift from the Mayer family, the building was transformed into what we call the Mayer Museum of Art. Though, as I said, and it's important, it's not an accredited museum, and it doesn't function as a separate entity. It doesn't have a separate board. It's a department of the college. It has a director. The college decided that we needed to raise money by selling art. We initially thought we might be able to share 10 or 20 works of art, and we went through a long process of debating that and talking to some significant other institutions about a sharing arrangement. That turned out not to be possible. We couldn't find an organization with whom we could reach an agreement. In the end, we decided that we are going to have to sell some works outright. And after a long process, the board selected 4 paintings that it was going to sell. And it was going to sell them at auction at Christie's in New York in the fall of 2007. That triggered extreme adverse reaction from some alumni. There was some litigation commenced. There was a temporary restraining order, which meant that we couldn't put it up for auction on the scheduled date. You'll all remember at the end of 2007 was not a very good time in the economics of this country. It also coincided with the top of the art market, and being temporarily blocked from selling that work caused a problem. The lawsuit was dismissed, and the college was free to sell the work, but we missed the top of the market. We sold one painting in May of 2008, a painting by a Mexican artist for what was then a world record price by a Mexican artist. It was sold at Christie's in May of 2008. The other three paintings were held for sale at a future date. They consisted
Peter, I'm sorry. I do want to stop you because I want to make sure that we can go to the other topics that we discussed, and hopefully we'll make sure we cover those details. So Bill, could you talk about your experience? Thank you. Your experience with de-accessioning policy and practice.
Yes, I want to say basically that I can say ditto to what Andria said earlier, and therefore I can be very brief and tell you something about my background. I have been the vice chair of the Accreditation Commission. I have been the vice chair of AAM. I'm currently on the board of ICOM, and in all of those instances, we have discussed de-accessioning. So it has been a constant, if you will, a characteristic of my career for the last 30 years is that discussion. In fact, I used to think that on my gravestone, I was going to have that word put, de-accession. And then I decided, no, that it would probably be better if it were muted. So therefore, I will stop for now.
Jamaal, could you please share your experience? You arrived at Fisk after de-accessioning, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what you discovered when you arrived?
Yeah, so first I'd like to say thank you once again. Thank you, Kristina. Thank you to the organizers. And I will echo what Bill said. I'm still chuckling on the inside from the de-accessioning comment, but I'm going to echo what he said in regards to Andria. Ditto. But I came to Fisk in 2015, and so that was after we had sold a 50% stake in the Alfred Stieglitz collection. Just to give you some cliff notes on Fisk, Fisk is a small, historically Black college located in Nashville, Tennessee. We have two galleries on campus, the Carlton Vechten and the Aaron Douglas Gallery. And we have a collection size of about 4,300 objects. The Alfred Stieglitz is 101. And so I can't talk about the events that led up to the university de-accessioning the collection, but what I can talk about is what we did afterwards. And so when I came in, it was about reaffirming and regaining the trust of our alumni, our faculty, our students, and the broader community. And so with that, throughout the discussion, I can go into further detail about some of the practices that we did. We also rewrote the de-accession, all the campus art policies, the accession policy, the de-accession policy, to include, we rewrote all of those policies as well. So I think I can talk more about it as we go throughout the conversation, but I just wanted to lay the groundwork for what I'm prepared to talk about. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you mentioned policy because, again, this is a session for institutions that have parent organizations, and the Association of Academic Museums and Galleries lays out in its best practices document that academic institutions should have documentation affirming the importance of the museum to the parent organization, and that could be something that could be passed by the president's office, or it could go before the Board of Trustees. And we also recommend that there's a document that delegates operating authority to the museum's director. So those are the best practices that we adhere to and recommend for our members. So I'd like to hear from our panelists about the process of working with either your boards of advisors, presidents, or trustees to inform them of the best practices that you operate as a museum. And Bill, why don't we start with you?
Sure. And again, I will be fairly brief because we do practice exactly what you said. Each board member, the provost office to whom I report, and the president's office at the University of Georgia get a copy of professional practices in art museums because we are an AMD museum. I meet with the associate provost monthly when we discuss not only what's happening at the museum, but also issues in the field. I find that this is helpful in protecting the museum should such issues arise that she needs to understand completely. The provost and other vice presidents are ad hoc members of our board of advisors. The provost office approves any changes to the policies and procedures of the museum. And a good example of that are our protocols regarding COVID and opening and reopening the museum. In addition to that governance ladder that I've just sort of explained, which reaches through the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia, all the way to the governor, we have 3 boards to help my limited and truly overburdened staff. That's the Board of Advisors, which right now is dealing with metrics. The Board of the Friends of the Museum, which right now is dealing with the bylaws, and the Decorative Arts Advisory Committee, which is looking at its reorganization at the retirement of the curator. All of these have formal meetings with appropriate committees and have in fact swerved to meet the exigencies of the pandemic. None, however, favor de-accessioning for general operating support.
Andrea, do you want to speak to the process that you've undertaken and how you've informed your board or president about de-accessioning? You just have to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I can just say briefly that like any educational process, it's really a series of conversations. And it's really just, conversations with the dean to whom I report, the president, when time needs it, the board of trustees, and of course the museum has an advisory committee, the visiting committee. But I think the thing is, in terms of that education, we're really fortunate to have bodies, to my mind, such as AAMD and AAM, and frankly ICOM and UNESCO and others, that have thought for decades about collections care and that have given us policies and guideline documents and examples and best practices from other institutions. I also think for museums, the reaccreditation process of AAM really helps because it forces you every 10 to 12, 15 years to really look hard at your processes and to have them revised and reaffirmed by your governing institution, including by its board of trustees. And so that's very helpful.
Thank you. Peter, I'd like to bring you into this conversation because in an earlier phone or Zoom call, you had mentioned that the trustees view the collection of the mayor, the trustees at the time viewed the collection as an asset class. Am I correct? I just don't want to put words in your mouth, but it was sort of as an asset class. And so there's a question in the chat that came up. What is the relationship with property management? Is the artwork at the Randolph held under property management, if I'm understanding that question correctly? And is there a different set of policies than the kinds of collection documents that we're talking about for that asset class at the Randolph?
First, it is a college asset, and unlike most organizations, perhaps unlike any organization listening in on this call, Randolph has always capitalized its art collection. It's actually shown on its balance sheet. That's an important point to get across. The collection is a direct college asset. It's a department of the college. There is a director, and she has a staff of a registrar, and I think there's one other staff member. It's a very small group of people. They follow collections management policies, as far as I know, based upon AAM. It's not an accredited museum, but it is a member of AAM, and to the extent that there are relevant policies for how art ought to be managed and conserved, I believe those are followed. I'm not quite sure I follow what the property management question really would mean. I mean, the art is absolutely conserved in accordance with museum standards and has been all along, and the director is charged with doing that. She reports to the college administration. There is no board of directors of the Mayer Museum. There is no board of advisors. It's a direct responsibility of the college to look after its collection. That's delegated to the staff through the director.
Thank you. I hope that answered the panelists, the participants' question. Regarding the policies and the procedures that you're following, Bill, I had a colleague, when they learned that I was going to be moderating this panel, told me that you actually had the college president listed in some of your documents as preventing trustees, college president from engaging in collecting or being able to acquire works of art that might be de-accessioned. Is that accurate? And I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, but this was just showing the level of involvement that you have for a university president and your administration in your thinking.
No, you're not putting me on the spot at all. I believe that it is best practice, and that the Accreditation Commission would agree that it is best practice, that your policies and procedures regarding collections management are referenced in your code of ethics. And consequently, our code of ethics does indeed bind those in the ladder, as I called it, or in those levels of governance as well. And so, yes, indeed, we give them those documents. We follow the professional practices in art museums, and so they go to anybody who is in the line of our governance, including the governor's office. And that goes through the Attorney General.
Okay, and this is a question, and I also want to make clear that all of the panelists at any time, if you want to unmute yourselves and ask another panelist a follow-up question, please do so. So in terms of ethics, this is a question that came from one of the participants. So what are the ethics of a university board requiring a museum professional to violate their professional ethics? What accommodations did Randolph College make for its museum professionals who were asked to do something against best practices for the field?
The board reached a decision about what needed to be done and directed the museum staff to follow the board's directions. At the time that first decision was made, the then director was not in support of that, and eventually she resigned. And later a new director was appointed. We acknowledge that museum professionals have standards. We did not feel that those standards applied to the college in the management and potential sale of a college asset. You could call it a conflict between the board's view of its duties to the primary institution, which is the college, and the management of the asset, and an individual's evaluation of her responsibilities, which she's free to follow. So we followed what we believe to be our fiduciary duty to manage the college. And if that came into conflict with policies that an individual employee of the college felt she was bound by, there was a conflict. And as I said, she resigned. The current director, who's been there for many years, follows the college's policies. And to the extent that the professional policies are not in conflict with the management of the college's assets, we are fully in support of them.
Anyone have any follow-up to Peter's comment? Bill, go ahead.
Well, Kristina, I would, let me start off by saying Peter and I have known each other for many years because we went through this together in a lot of ways, but I still would ask this question, and that would be, isn't it disingenuous, Peter? I thought it was at the time, and I still think it's somewhat disingenuous to say that the mayor is not a museum. You know, it's called a museum. It's even discussed as a museum, and here you're telling us that it follows some of the practices of the museum associations, to which you are right, it does not belong. So I just, you know, would ask that question, and I think that's at the root of what the question from the chat or from the question and answer period was, and that is, how can you not call yourself, well, you do call yourself a museum.
The word museum is in the name, no question. That word was not used until about the 1980s. The college had an art collection which it maintained, displayed, added to each year, used directly for educational purposes. It wasn't until the value of the art became so significant that we felt for custodial reasons it needed to be in a better place, and the building where it is in became available, that it was moved there. It was originally called the Art Gallery. Back to about the 1970s. It was renamed as the Mayer Art Museum in 1983, I believe, when the Mayer family very generously gave money, not to buy art. It was not Mayer Art Collection. They gave money to renovate the building, and we're very thankful that they did. Yes, of course, the fact that we have the name museum is confusing, but I've wrestled with the issue of, you know, is it a museum, is it not a museum? To some extent, I think that's a bit of a red herring, Bill. The issue is the art. The issue is, what are we doing with the art? What label do you put on the institution that holds it? I think puts form over substance.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question, because
Yeah,
I'm thinking about this and trying to rationalize it, as well as thinking about Fisk, which we've been a collecting institution since the 1870s, but the gallery wasn't founded in 1949. And then thinking about the documentation post then, when objects came into the collection, was positive, well, at least in the last 30 or 40 years, most positive that they have been accessioned into Fisk University Gallery's collection. The same thing with the libraries. And so, and the library may have artwork in their collection. We may care for it, but it's a part of the library's collection. And so I wonder, does that, for you all institutions, do you all have a formal designation that this is university property or this is the gallery's property? Now, granted, well, I'm gonna ask that for you all.
I mean, I can just say at Oberlin, there are works that are accessioned into the Allen Memorial Art Museum, and those are the works that we care for. There certainly are other artworks around the campus, including some public art, some art that's in offices or you know, different buildings that we don't care for. But we really just take care of the works that we have accessioned at the museum.
And Jamaal, I would echo that as well. I mean, at the University of New Hampshire, the museum has a collection. There's also special collections held by the library. And then there's an inventory of artwork around the campus that is held by neither of us, but is held by the university.
Jamaal, we also, similar to what Kristina and Andria are describing, and it's coming to a head right now because the University of Georgia has many buildings and many monuments named after Confederate soldiers, Confederate officers, and we're being asked to take care of those objects, or they're being asked to be sent to the museum for the museum to be the repository for it. And so we have recently developed a policy, and it's a rather strict policy, that we will not take those objects.
Thank you.
I'd like
Just
to
a quick follow-up with
Sure.
respect to Randolph, like I think probably each of these institutions, we have art is still hung in classrooms and around the country. We have a campus collection and then what we call the Mayer collection. We do distinguish between them, but that's basically based on the value of the art. It's not a legal distinction in ownership at all.
Okay, thank you. And at Fisk, I think we're all on the same page, but sorry.
no, go ahead. I do want to bring us back to the issue that Bill and Peter were speaking about, and that is the idea of intent, donor intent. I know that that's an issue when we're collecting works of art. I don't know if any of you were able to attend yesterday's legal issues strategies, but the attorneys from the public charities divisions were really speaking about the intent of gifts, the intent of the donor, as well as the interpretation, how they really refer back to a museum's or an academic institution's collections policies and practices. And so they look at that when they're trying to make a determination around de-accessioning. And so a question from one of the participants is, why do universities treat the gift of work of art differently than another kind of gift? Couldn't donors simply stipulate that the work of art they're donating is exclusively owned by the museum, and I'm just understanding that to mean the academic museum, for their purposes? Wouldn't that resolve the concern that a struggling university could de-accession its museum collection for its own purposes? So putting in that kind of legal restriction to the gift. Universities can't do that with an endowed fund given to the business or law school. I don't understand why we can't solve that issue, at least with better legal protection when a gift is given. And I'd like to also point out that the 990 for public charitable trusts asks institutions, and this is the question, if they receive or solicit donations of art, historical treasure, or other similar assets to be sold to raise funds rather than be maintained as part of the organization's collection. And I bring that up because the Randolph's 990, they check off no. And from what I'm understanding is that that's not the case, that they do hold the collection for the purpose of potentially selling it. So I'd like to know from your experiences, what kind of differences there may be in how your university perceives gifts.
Well, if I can respond on the Randolph point, I would frankly disagree with your characterization of how we hold the art. The art which the college owns was purchased consistently for the development of a collection for educational purposes. It was always been held for that purpose. To my knowledge, the college never sold art before until it reached the decision that it had to do that in 2007. It certainly wasn't. Yes, the art was held as a capital asset, and the college has always capitalized it. And in fact, if you go all the way back to the beginning, to the very first significant acquisitions, you can find commentary in the Alumni Association saying the art would be a good financial investment. That's something that was written in 1920. But that's not actually what the college was doing with the art. It was using for educational purposes. Every student went to look at the art and was taught through the art. And the other thing I want to point out is that a lot of the art was not donated, it was purchased. So donor restriction, some of the art certainly has been donated. To the best of my knowledge, the college does not accept restrictions on art that is donated. It goes into the college art collection and is held free of restriction.
Andrea, it looked like you were about to say something.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, I can just say that at Oberlin, the collections are explicitly in the 990 held for public exhibition, education, and research, and are protected. They're not capitalized. But realizing that other institutions may do things differently, I think I don't know if this will get to the question that the person posed to you, but the museum here we would never seek a gift of artwork for the purpose of selling it. There's so much paperwork involved in any acquisition, and even more so in a de-accession, and rightly so, that it's just too difficult to do that. I think if you're going to go to the effort to do all the logistics involved, transportation, storage, insurance to receive a work, it should be because you really, really want that as part of your collection for teaching, not that it would simply be sold, because really there's no simply about it. In terms of that's just what I can say, I guess, about why you don't accept things just for the purpose of selling them. It's quite a lot of work, and we would only accept things very seriously if we would want them for educational purposes.
And just to follow up, and that applies to Randolph. Randolph does not accept art for the purposes of selling it. That's why the answer is given in the 990, which I think is completely correct.
Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Kristina, we don't solicit or accept work solely for resale. In the one case when it happened, it included an agreement that the work would await the arrival of a curator of European art with the expertise to decide its disposition, whether it would join the collection or be de-accessioned. Therefore, it was not accessioned awaiting that decision. Jamaal, if I can answer the first part of her case of her question with the example from Fisk, because it is another issue that is at the core of our discussions today, which is de-accessioning after all. And one of the underlying questions in Fisk's case had been the strong conviction by the Tennessee Attorney General and public opinion also in Nashville that although the collection was housed at Fisk and technically belonging to Fisk, the collection as left by Georgia O'Keeffe actually was a shared treasure with all Nashvillians, indeed all Tennesseans, and an integral part of the artistic history of the state. As in the cases elsewhere with adjudication by the courts or the threat of it, Tennessee's Attorney General maintained that, quote, the only party with the authority to seek or enforce these conditions of O'Keeffe's gift is the Attorney General. And that's what we heard yesterday in that referenced in that discussion you talked about. The Attorney General in Tennessee, who represents the interests of all beneficiaries of this charitable gift, close quote. Further, his office noted that the collection is a charitable gift and not an asset that Fisk can dispose of at will, but that a court has to decide if the conditions of the gift can be modified and to what degree, close quote. Thus, we have another example of disposal and de-accessioning issues from the beginning, the very beginning of the current brouhaha, and that's the intrusion into the process of government agencies as well as the courts, because in fact, the Attorney General lost that case in the court, and Fisk went ahead with the shared sale with Crystal Bridges.
Bill, just to follow up with that, so do you, I mean, it's kind of a question in terms of the public trust. You and I are both at publicly funded universities, land grant institutions. Should the public have a greater role in the de-accessioning process if things are understood to be benefits to people outside of the university? And maybe Jamaal, that's something that you want to think about too, or comment on.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to very quickly tell you a story. We're interested in the education of possible museum professionals. So we have a certificate program, and we decided that we would crib an example from another museum and test the notion of what the public knew about de-accessioning and what they would think, what our community would think about it, what our public would think about it. We actually put 6 works by an artist who'd never been shown by the museum, probably no possibility that his works would be shown by the museum, even in the future, if you're talking 200 years from now. Of course, who knows, but we figured that he would not be shown, and we let the public help us decide which ones to de-accession. And you know what we found out was that they didn't want us to de-accession any of them, even though they agreed that they were not of the quality that they would expect from the Georgia Museum of Art. We found that, so we ended up actually keeping 2 of them rather than because it was basically a vote. So to answer your question with that example, I'll give you my statement, and that is, I do believe that the public, especially the community of service that you really service, can have engagement with de-accessioning decisions. And as we have seen with the recent controversies particularly in Baltimore over de-accessioning, perhaps it's best to gauge and engage community feeling as one step in the process.
I'd like to ask Andria, when you've undertaken de-accessioning, have you involved that broader community of service? How have you engaged alum, if you have at all, in conversations about de-accessioning?
I really should let you know that the de-accessioning we've done here since I've been the director, it has been frankly super, super minor and conservative. So we found that we had some flax carters and a lemon squeezer in our basement. We had a lot of cups and saucers from, you know, literally the kind of thing you would find at maybe the local antique shop. Maybe your grandmother had that kind of thing on her table. Mine did. So it wasn't really anything that anyone would really consider fine art. And that's my point, really, at least for me. And again, I can only speak for myself. These were things that just should never have been in an academic art museum collection. And so it was a collection management strategy to de-accession them. So our registrar, who's very knowledgeable about our collection, was able to point some of these things out. Of course, we did all the due diligence that one does when one de-accessions. You know, if you believe something's over a certain value, you get an appraisal. We talked, if there's something, in this case there wasn't, if there's a faculty member at the college who has expertise in a certain area, you get their opinion. You see, for an academic museum, how often has this been used in teaching? Has it been used in research? Has it been on view? As you can imagine, in our case with the flax carters and the lemon squeezer and the cups and saucers, they hadn't been. So it was really not a controversial de-accession. We haven't done anything here that I think would be considered a controversial de-accession, if that answers your question.
It does, and I'm glad that you brought in bringing in faculty expertise and other areas. There was a question about how universities that have art, archaeological, or other types of collection that are not overseen by the museum might handle de-accessioning, and I think you answered that question. Bill, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was. Since Andria brought it up, obviously those items were not mission-centric for her museum. She's an art museum. So I was going to ask her, I have floated this idea at AMD, and I've also recently floated it at the Southeastern Art Museum Directors Consortium and got pushback from that very idea. Is one way in which we could use funding is if we sell non-mission-centric objects such as Andria just described. Because I presume, Andria, that you did use the proceeds from those sales according to AMD's professional guidance, right?
Correct, right. Which is to simply, again, with the understanding that we all have prior to April 2020 of buying additional works for the collection, or using those funds for only collection works.
Right, so do you think that that's a criterion that we may talk about in the future, or is that just muddying and complicating an already complicated process to look at what is not mission centric?
I mean, I guess I feel like that's what the staff decides. I mean, that's what our curators and our registrar and myself and the people that we consulted with, we're the ones who decide, is this mission centric or not? And then I feel like if you decide that as a staff with, again, all the appropriate checks and balances, then it's fine to use those proceeds to acquire other art. I guess I don't know that we would need any additional step in there than we already have.
So Bill, to that point, that if there are things that are not mission centric, whether it be lemon squeezers or tea caddies, when you're an art museum and those things don't fit your mission, or maybe it's public art that was put on campus, but was not part of the museum's collection and no longer fits the museum's collection. What were you trying to advocate for, and what guardrails do you think would be helpful if AAMD were to take up those recommendations?
Well, when I floated this idea to colleagues, they said, oh, that's just another slippery slope. I was trying to prevent it from being a slippery slope by saying that precisely what Andria just described. She's an art museum. She does not need a lemon grater. It doesn't do anything to further her mission that I know of. She can correct me if I'm wrong. We have objects like that, and I know other academic museums, and particularly in our 75 years of existence, we have received objects that we could easily do not conform to our mission of fine arts. And so that's what I'm trying to say. I do push back from that notion, however.
Okay, Peter, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I'd like to go to the question of the mission and mission-centric. From the Randolph College perspective, our mission is to educate students. The proceeds and students, particularly ones who can't necessarily afford the liberal arts full tuition. In fact, virtually every student at Randolph receives financial aid. We needed to boost our endowment so we could have a larger sum to take a sustainable draw for it, which could be used to provide financial aid for students and necessary capital expenditures. That's the mission of the college. And we were applying the art towards the mission of the college. And we felt that very strongly. It was a difficult, painful decision, but we needed to raise the money to do it. And that's what we did, and that's what we spent the money on. Frankly, we don't accept that AAMD has any jurisdiction whatsoever over the Randolph College Art Collection, and we've told them so. They may disagree, but I'm perfectly confident in that. So we raised a lot of money. We raised a total of $35 million, more than $35 million from selling four works of art. The largest sum of money, which many people will know about, was $25.5 million from selling a painting by George Bellows, Men of the Docks, to the National Gallery of Art in London, which was a very, very big deal for the college. And that was combined with the money, we established an academic relationship with the National Gallery, which includes internships for students to go to the National Gallery in London. I believe it is correct that there is no other academic institution in the United States that has that relationship with the National Gallery. That selling that painting produced a lot of money. It also developed a relationship which is of great value to the college. That was part of our mission.
I think that we can talk about sort of strategy or maybe outcomes a little bit later, but in terms of outcome and using the proceeds, I understood that the argument for de-accessioning was to invest in capital expenditures. And in fact, Peter, I checked, the amount of money that's going to Randolph students in terms of scholarships has declined over the past 3 years. So I'm not sure if the sale of the Bellows has been sustainable in terms of the goals that the trustees set for themselves.
The money went into the endowment. I'm not on the board now, and I don't know the college. I don't know what the amount of the endowment is right now. There is a draw that has been taken from that, and that some portion of that goes to support tuition and expenses for students. The object, some of the draw was being used for capital expenditures. There's no question. The fact that the endowment was increased substantially by the proceeds of the art sale, no doubt that helped encourage other people to donate money. There were some significant private donations made, which funded very important, though decidedly unsexy capital expenditures, like redoing the heating and cooling, which we got funding for donors. Not that all kind of thing is easy to, but we were doing that because we would put the college on a more financially sustainable track. I don't have the numbers for the amount of tuition right now. I refer you to the college for that, and the college administration would be happy, I'm sure, to respond on that. I don't have the numbers, but to my knowledge, the proceeds have been used directly for the college mission.
Peter, I'm just going to follow up with you. There's a question that has come in from a panelist, a participant who wants to know, like, in terms of fundraising for capital expenses, you said after the sale of the Bellows, you did receive some significant gifts, and yet prior to the sale of the Bellows, fundraising was seemed to be infeasible. And so this person is asking, what's the contradiction? What might have been missed in terms of those fundraising assessments?
There's no contradiction. At the time we just made the decision, so this was within a year after we'd made a very controversial decision about the college. There was a great deal of upset among the alumni. There were lawsuits. We had lawsuits challenging the college's right to go co-educational. There were lawsuits claiming the college was a trust. We got a unanimous decision from the Virginia Supreme Court saying that wasn't the case. It takes time to get over these, the level of unhappiness that was created, and that opposition has receded, and people have become much more willing to give money. There have always been people who were in support of what the college did, including its unpopular decisions that were unpopular among some people. There were many people who said this was absolutely the right decision to do, both to go co-ed, change the name, and to sell the art. We had people firmly in support of those decisions, and they provided money. Doing a broad brush capital campaign in 2007 wouldn't have been the right thing to do. There's a capital campaign going on right now for some significant capital expenditures. It's now 14 years later. Time has moved on. People's mood has changed. That's why. It's not a contradiction.
Thank you. Jamaal, do you want to talk a little bit about what you encountered when you arrived at Fisk and sort of the aftermath in terms of fundraising and relationships with alumni and your community?
So absolutely. I want to jump ahead first, and then I'm going to go back. So this year, we've celebrated 5 consecutive years of our endowment increasing. We've broken fundraising records for the last 5 consecutive years. And then also enrollment has increased for the last 7 or 10 consecutive years. So post sale, the institution is in a much better place. But when I came to Fisk, it was most of the documents were still held with the law firm. So even getting access to the documents relating to that collection was no longer, I didn't have access to it. But the other thing was there was a lot of mistrust. So my first task was to reopen the gallery. It had been under renovation, it had been closed for 2 years. And so literally people did not believe that the collection was coming back to the institution. Also, there were people that were saying, well, why stop there? We should continue to unload or to sell objects or de-accession objects in our collection. And so the first thing that we decided to do was really to, one, make sure the collection is active. You know, my provost said, Jamaal, don't be over there in the crowd, hang out in witness protection, you know. And so literally the first task at hand was to get the students engaged. And so we focused on integrating it into all academic disciplines. That was a huge charge that we have been more successful at times than others. The other thing is that I spent a lot of time talking with the arts community. I literally would spend a couple days a week. This is leading up to the gallery opening. A couple days a week meeting with collectors, gallerists, museum professionals around the Middle Tennessee, just to let them know that it was coming back and kind of the vision moving forward. And so once we open and also I spent a lot of time talking with alumni and our other constituents. I think Andria said it earlier, it's about relationships. So we spent a lot of conversations in that process. The same thing with the board. I would have several conversations with the board, and we would also begin to do a tour. And surprisingly, many times it was the first time that some of the board members had been into the gallery. Now, I will say this also, there's not a board member, I believe, nor is there an administrator that is still on or affiliated with the institution today. So let me say that just to let you know about the time that has passed. And so with that, we were able to garner or get the support of the community. And then also we were able to begin to repair those relationships, and we're just now starting to see the fruits of that. Now, going back to what happened after the 7-year legal battle, what it did do after the sale that we now call a partnership, because that's what it truly is, it's a partnership. A lot has come out of that. So first, let me say there's a committee, the Alfred Stieglitz Committee, that governs the Stieglitz collection. So that includes me, president of Fisk, 2 people from Crystal Bridges, and then two independent museum professionals. So that's who governs it. Another part of the sale was a endowment that was set aside for collection care for facilities, for insurance, and care of the collection that was set to also just focus to support that collection. But outside of that, what's come out of that has been a great partnership with Crystal Bridges. For our museum leadership program, they were one of our early partners, as well as the O'Keeffe Museum, who was also jumped in that 7-year legal battle. Cody Hartlett and the O'Keeffe have been also an amazing partner, and I've worked with my students for the last 4 years. So I hope that answers the question.
It did, and I think that the fact that you engaged your students is really important. That was a question that somebody had put in the Q&A. They were wondering the involvement of students, current students in de-accessioning issues. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A. As a group, we had come up with our own questions, but I'm mindful of the time. We have about 12 minutes left, and the title of this panel is Strategies. And I want to just sort of shift our focus a little bit to talk about maybe some strategies going forward, if that's okay with the panelists and certainly with the people speaking. One of the approaches that I had proposed to you, not my idea, but it was proposed by Judith Dobrinsky in an opinion piece in 2010 called The Art of the Deal that was published in the New York Times. And she proposed a different model for de-accessioning deliberation. And one of them is arbitration. And she posits, what if a museum had to argue its case for de-accessioning art before an impartial arbiter? And so it would be a neutral party. It might be, maybe it's a group, schooled in art, art law, nonprofit regulation. And correspondingly, she goes on to suggest that the museum would need to open its financial books completely so that the arbitrator could see that all other reasonable avenues of fundraising as well as cutbacks had already been exhausted. So I just wanted to put it out there to you as just as we're thinking about strategies, what are some things that we might adopt as a field in terms of policies and practice that could safeguard collections and ensure their availability for generations?
I'll start if you want me to. In looking at what we've done, I mean, AMD has already given us one reaction to this, and that's by establishing the moratorium. We're in the middle of the pandemic. We still are in the middle of the pandemic, but the museum community has established means of adjudicating as well as advising on de-accessioning. And some of the examples of that is AMG itself, its guidelines, for example, in which they do consider direct care in the AMG guidelines. The AMG also has a task force on collections, and that task force has a toolkit.
That'll be coming out soon.
That is helpful for people who are having, let's say, issues around collections, very helpful. AMD, it is going to have to elaborate that discussion. I agree with Ann Pasternak from the earlier discussion that we're going to have a fuller discussion of disposal and de-accessioning, but professional practices in art museums does contain ample information about de-accessioning and disposal now that can be a guideline. There are AAM's white pages, which I find problematic, but also ICOM. And just to go a little bit farther, because I don't think that we're at the point yet where we can strategize with certainty, but basically we really are strategizing. ICOM intends to come up with a new definition of museums, and that new definition of museums is going to decide whether or not to include in museums, in the very definition of museums, collections. So as our keynote speaker said, Kaywin, we're in a rapid change for museums, and I find that we already have means to adjudicate some of these questions or to get advice about some of these questions, but that there will be strategies in the future that we will have to, that may be new, that may be imaginative, that may be different ways. arbitration may be one of them.
So I'm going to take a quick stab at it, not a quick stab at it, but you know, I was Bill, as you were talking, I was thinking about what Peter said earlier about how he doesn't subscribe, or it doesn't matter what the AAMD or AAM, the sanctions, what they do. And so that makes me think about, okay, what kind of strategy can other institutions or small institutions that don't have all those provisions in place to support the collections? And so with that, the first strategy that comes to mind is to build advocacy from within and outside of your campus communities. And then the other part is that following up with the building advocacy is also working with the administration to be as transparent as possible throughout the process. I think transparency is also another key part of the strategy as well. I just wanted to interject that, and I saw that Peter had his hand up, so I'm going to defer to Peter.
Two things. First, Jamaal, thanks so much for your comment. With respect to strategies and with respect to museums with parent organizations, I think there's no question that one of the strategies that those tasked with running the museum need to do is to make sure their interests are aligned with the primary parent organization. If you get at odds with that, you're going to end up in a car wreck. You've got to figure out how you can make your institution work with the primary institution. Otherwise, it isn't going to work. I would like to comment on the arbitration proposal. Interesting idea, not workable. Arbitrators exist to resolve disputes between people. I don't see how, I think it would be an abdication of the responsibility of a board to say, we don't know what we're supposed to do, so let's go ask somebody else to make the decision for us. If you can't make the decision, as hard as it may be, you don't deserve to be on the board.
Yes, I would just add to that too. I don't either really think that arbitration is something that we would necessarily go to. I mean, I guess I feel like there's already so many structures in place. Obviously, museum staffs, boards of parent institutions, in some cases, states attorneys general, lawyers. That there is a process laid out in terms of AAMD and AAMG. And I don't know that they would need a bigger role in that process, or that another party that may not be as well informed and educated about museum work would need to be involved. I think it's something that we can solve within our field.
Bill, go ahead.
Kristina, just very quickly, I want to respond to what Jamaal said, because I agree with him. We are all representatives, all four of us are representative of small museums. We may be academic museums, but we are small museums. And so I want to really point out what Jamaal said. I've always believed that we need to look to grassroots museums to support grassroots museums, because since we don't have any money, or since grassroots museums have to struggle for money, then they must come up with novel, imaginative, and real responses to issues or to concerns. De-accessioning is one of them. And so I'm looking to places like Jamaal's or like mine for answers, for strategies going forward. But I'm also looking at them as extremely vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think with the current pandemic, many of our institutions, parent organizations are extremely vulnerable right now in terms of tuition dollars and how they're going to support themselves. And I hope that there's funding available to help them with that. We are nearing the end of our time. I wanted to thank all of you for participating in this very important conversation. There are many more questions than we could possibly get to. So I thank all of the participants who submitted questions. Oh, Peter, go ahead.
I just wanted to add quickly, for those people who are interested, particularly in the Randolph College story, there are links at the end of your materials. On the last page of the document, there are links to documents relating to that. I've written quite extensively about the Randolph College decision process. There are two fairly long articles there. There's a third one that's about to be published. So I just wanted to let you know that those links are there, and there's far more there than I could possibly tell today. So please don't overlook those.
Thank you. And I would also like to say that Bill had referenced AAMG's toolkit on de-accessioning. It provides resources that will be coming out soon, so that will be a valuable resource for the field as well. So look for that on our listserv and on our website for when that becomes available to people. But I'd like to thank Peter Dean for sharing his experience, Bill Eiland, Andria Derstine, and Jamaal Sheats for engaging in this really important conversation. I really appreciate your time and your experience. And Andrew, thank you for inviting me to moderate. It's been a pleasure. And Tiffany, thank you for helping out behind the scenes, as well as Kyle.
Well said. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
And
Enjoyed it.
thank you, Kristina. Just to remind everyone, we're going to have a brief break, a lunch break, and we will see you back at 1:30 for today's keynote address by Christopher Bedford. A reminder, you can always check our bulletin board on the website for up-to-date changes and any announcements. And another reminder that we'll be sharing the recordings for this event with all registered participants. Keep an eye out for in the coming weeks for an email with links that will also include an evaluation that will help us plan for future events. I wish we could spend more time with this. There are so many fantastic questions, but thank you so much, and we'll see you with Chris Bedford.